December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii erupted in fire. Within 2 hours, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships burning, aircraft destroyed, more than 2,000 Americans dead. Across the Pacific, the Empire of Japan advanced almost without opposition. The Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies all fell within weeks. To the American public, it felt like defeat after defeat. President Roosevelt promised retaliation. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. But how? Japan lay more than 4,000 miles away from the nearest American base. No U.S. aircraft could reach Tokyo and return. And yet, inside the Pentagon, a small group of officers began to ask the unthinkable question. Could Japan itself be bombed? In January 1942, Navy Captain Francis S. Lowe visited a training field in Norfolk, Virginia. From an observation post, he watched carrier pilots practicing bombing runs and noticed twin-engine Army bombers painted on the runway as targets. A thought struck him. What if bombers like those could actually take off from a carrier deck? He hurried to report the idea to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations. King listened and then forwarded it to the Army Air Forces. At Wright Field in Ohio, one name stood out for testing bold, near-impossible projects: Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. Before the war, Doolittle had been an air racing legend and aviation pioneer. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering and had set speed and distance records across the 1930s. Now, at 45, he was an operations officer on General Hap Arnold's staff. Brilliant, restless, and utterly fearless. When the proposal landed on his desk, Doolittle studied it for barely an hour before saying, "It can be done." In March 1942, the chosen crews arrived at Eglin Field. For 3 grueling weeks, they trained in secrecy. Pilots practiced short field takeoffs again and again, learning to lift heavy bombers in less than 500 feet. Navigators studied oceanic dead reckoning. Bombardiers trained with the new Norden sight, adapted for low-altitude runs. Fuel management, radio silence, and emergency ditching drills filled every day. Lieutenant Henry Miller, a Navy flight instructor familiar with carrier operations, coached them personally. He marked a 500-foot line on the runway and stood at the end, signaling each crew to gun their engines and pull up just before him. By the end of training, every pilot could clear that mark with room to spare. The men sensed the importance of what they were doing. One recalled later, "You could tell from the colonel's eyes. This wasn't another exercise. We were going to make history, or die trying." On March 31st, 1942, the 16 modified B-25s were hoisted onto the deck of USS Hornet at Alameda, California. Each plane was lashed down, wings overlapping the ship's island superstructure, an extraordinary sight for anyone who saw the secret photographs later. The next morning, Hornet steamed west under complete radio silence. Her orders were simple: join USS Enterprise and its escort ships and head for Japan. The sailors aboard Hornet didn't know what the Army bombers were for. A sign on one aircraft read, "Tokyo bound." When word spread, cheers echoed across the decks. The combined task force, Task Force 16, was commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey. His orders were to get Doolittle's bombers within 500 miles of Japan, launch them, then turn back before Japanese patrols could locate his fleet. Everything depended on stealth, weather, and luck. As the carrier steamed across the rough Pacific, crews maintained their aircraft, checked bomb fuses, and prepared for the unknown. No one could yet guess how costly or how legendary the raid would become. For 2 weeks, USS Hornet and USS Enterprise plowed west through a cold, restless Pacific. On deck, the 16 B-25s were lashed tight beneath tarps, guarded around the clock. The bombers took up nearly every inch of flight deck. No fighter could take off while they were aboard. If the task force were discovered, the fleet would be vulnerable to Japanese attack. Below decks, the mood alternated between boredom and tension. The Army crews lived among the sailors, eating Navy rations and sleeping in cramped bunks. The weather worsened as they moved deeper into enemy waters. Rain, fog, heavy seas. Each morning, Doolittle held quiet briefings in his cabin, refining the flight plan and reviewing maps of Japan. The plan called for launching 400 to 450 miles east of the Japanese coast, striking Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Each aircraft would then turn southwest, cross the East China Sea, and try to reach airfields controlled by Chinese nationalist forces. There would be no rendezvous, no return to the carrier, and almost no radio communication. It was, in every sense, a one-way mission. Doolittle knew the risks. He told his men plainly, "We'll probably lose them all. But if we can make Tokyo burn, it'll be worth it." At dawn, on April 18th, 1942, Task Force 16 was 650 nautical miles from Japan. Still too far for the bomber's planned launch point. But fate intervened. A Japanese picket boat, number 23 Nitomaru, spotted the approaching ships and sent a warning signal before it was sunk by the destroyer USS Nashville. The message was short but devastating. The fleet was detected. Halsey and Doolittle met on the flag bridge. Halsey didn't hesitate. He signaled across the intercom, "Launch planes," to Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command. "Good luck and God bless you." It was still early morning. Heavy seas slammed against Hornet's bow, pitching the deck steeply. The ships were more than 170 miles farther from Japan than planned, meaning the B-25s would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching China. But Doolittle knew turning back wasn't an option. At 8:20 a.m., the first bomber, Doolittle's own, lined up on the deck. He throttled forward, engines screaming against the gale. Spray crashed over the bow. Sailors braced themselves as the bomber lumbered ahead, rose at the final moment, and lifted clear of the waves. A cheer erupted. One by one, 15 more bombers followed. Each takeoff was a miracle. Full bomb loads, extra fuel, heavy wind. The last aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant William Farrow, cleared the deck just as the carrier's bow pitched downward into a swell. All 16 were airborne. The Hornet turned sharply and retreated east. The formation scattered, each crew alone now over open water. Below them stretched endless gray ocean. Ahead, the Japanese coast. To save fuel, they flew low, barely 200 feet above the waves, using the horizon for cover. Navigation was primitive. Dead reckoning, compass headings, and sheer instinct. After nearly 4 hours, the first islands of Japan appeared through mist. Doolittle's crew climbed to 1,500 feet, broke through the clouds, and saw Tokyo spread out beneath them. Factories, shipyards, rail yards, targets that had seemed unreachable now lay exposed. At 12:25 p.m., the first bombs fell. Doolittle's aircraft struck an industrial section of eastern Tokyo near the docks. Moments later, smoke rose from fuel tanks and warehouses. Civilians looked up in shock. Air raid sirens began to wail. Within minutes, more B-25s appeared over Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened fire, tracers arcing into the sky. But the bombers were fast and low, hard to hit. Fighter response was confused. No one had expected twin-engine bombers this deep over Japan. One crew strafed a munitions plant. Another dropped incendiaries on oil depots near Yokosuka. A few bombs missed, exploding in residential areas. Tragic reminders that even symbolic raids carried deadly consequences. In all, about 15 tons of explosives were dropped across several cities. Material damage was moderate, but the psychological impact was immense. For the first time in the war, the Japanese homeland was under attack. The myth of invulnerability was broken. As Doolittle later wrote, "Our primary goal was to let the people of Japan know they could be reached." After the bombing runs, the aircraft turned southwest toward China. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. Headwinds were stronger than expected, and night was falling. The bombers flew into worsening weather, thick clouds driving rain, turbulence. One by one, they crossed the Chinese coast near midnight, searching for landing lights that weren't there. The Chinese airfields had been alerted too late. Most crews never found them. With tanks empty, they made desperate choices: bail out, crash land, or ditch in darkness. Doolittle and his men parachuted near the town of Chuchao. He hit the ground hard, bruised but alive. For hours, he wandered alone in the rain before Chinese farmers found him and led him to safety. Of the 16 planes, 15 crashed in China. One, running short of fuel, diverted north and landed in Vladivostok, Soviet Union, where its crew was interned. 2 airmen drowned after ditching near the coast. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed, 1 died in prison, and 4 survived brutal captivity until war's end. The rest, with the help of courageous Chinese villagers, eventually reached friendly territory. By dawn, news of explosions in Tokyo reached Japanese military headquarters. Initial reports were disbelieved. How could American bombers have come from the sea? Japanese commanders feared more attacks and scrambled to locate the source. Only later did they learn it was a single, one-way mission launched from a carrier. In the U.S., the story was kept secret for weeks for security reasons. When it was finally announced, headlines blared, "Tokyo bombed. U.S. strikes back." Crowds cheered, factories halted for impromptu celebrations. The material damage had been minor, but the psychological boost was massive. For a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was proof that America could hit back. For Japan, the raid was a humiliation. The government imposed strict censorship to hide the attack's success. But internally, military leaders were furious. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto vowed to destroy America's carriers once and for all, a resolve that would lead him to plan the decisive battle at Midway 2 months later. Yet the raid carried a tragic cost few Americans knew at the time. In retaliation, Japanese forces launched a brutal campaign across eastern China to punish regions that had aided the downed crews. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and entire towns wiped out. Historians estimate as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians died in those reprisals. When Doolittle learned of it after the war, he was haunted. But even with that weight, he never doubted the necessity of the mission. Without it, the United States might never have regained the morale and momentum it needed to win the Pacific War. By late April 1942, scattered reports of the missing bombers reached U.S. command in Chongqing. Chinese guerrillas, missionaries, and farmers had risked their lives to hide and guide the airmen through Japanese-occupied territory. Over the next few weeks, 64 of the 80 men who took off from the Hornet were rescued and returned to Allied lines. When Doolittle finally reached Chongqing, he believed the mission had been a failure. Every plane lost, several men dead or captured. It felt like disaster. He expected court-martial, not celebration. But General Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, met him with a grin and said, "You've done more than you know, Jimmy. You've given America back its pride." Soon after, Doolittle was summoned to Washington, D.C. There, in a quiet White House ceremony, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor on his uniform. He was promoted 2 ranks, from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, the fastest such promotion in modern U.S. military history. For the men who flew with him, honors followed. Each received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The captured airmen were later recognized with POW medals and Purple Hearts. The raid electrified the United States. Until that moment, most Americans had felt the Pacific War was far away, dominated by defeat after defeat. Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore. But now, Tokyo itself had burned. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, there was laughter in the streets, confidence in the air. Newspapers ran maps of the bombers' routes. Posters declared, "Remember Pearl Harbor! Remember Tokyo!" Young men lined up at recruiting stations. Factories redoubled production. The public didn't know the operation's full details, nor its risks. But they didn't need to. They knew one thing clearly. America could fight back. But the price was horrific. Japanese occupation forces, enraged by Chinese cooperation with the American airmen, launched Operation Seigo, a massive punitive campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. Entire villages were burned, water wells poisoned, and civilians massacred. Doctors and missionaries who had sheltered the Americans were executed. Historians later estimated up to 250,000 Chinese civilians perished in the aftermath, one of the darkest, least known consequences of the war. The American crews who survived were devastated when they learned of this after 1945. Many later raised funds to rebuild the regions that had protected them, honoring the courage of the Chinese people who had saved their lives. For Doolittle, the raid was only the beginning. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in Italy, and finally the 8th Air Force in England, leading thousands of heavy bombers across Europe. By the war's end, he had become one of America's most respected air commanders. After retiring from active service, he continued to shape aviation policy, serving as a civilian advisor and advocate for aerospace innovation. In 1989, at age 92, he was promoted to full four-star general, one of the few in history to receive that honor in retirement. As for his raiders, they returned quietly to their lives: farmers, teachers, engineers, fathers. But they remained bound by what they had done together. They began meeting once a year, each April, to remember. At every reunion, they drank a toast to those who didn't make it home, using silver goblets, engraved with each man's name. When one passed away, his goblet was turned upside down. By the 2000s, only a handful of raiders were still alive. In 2013, 3 of them gathered for their final public reunion at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. They opened the last bottle of cognac saved since the 1950s and raised one final toast. Their message was simple: to our brothers who are gone, and to the future of America. Though the raid destroyed little in material terms, its effects were strategic and psychological. For the U.S., it boosted morale at a critical moment. For Japan, it exposed deep flaws in intelligence and defense planning. More importantly, it forced Japan to stretch its naval forces thin to guard against future attacks, an overextension that would prove fatal at Midway. The raid also marked the first time medium bombers had ever launched from an aircraft carrier, a feat that would influence naval air coordination for years to come. It demonstrated that creativity, daring, and resolve could overcome even the most impossible odds. In the decades that followed, the Doolittle raid became a symbol of American resilience. It has been depicted in countless books, documentaries, and films, from 30 Seconds Over Tokyo in 1944 to modern retellings in Midway, 2019.